In the summer of 2025, from the icy waters of the Arctic to the far-flung waters of the Pacific, the Russian Navy is on the move. It's called July Storm, Moscow's largest naval exercise of the year. But in the shadow of the war in Ukraine and rising tensions with NATO, what message is Russia trying to send? Is this a genuine show of force from a global naval power or the last roar of a wounded bear? We asked an expert to find out.
From what we understand, July Storm, the big Russian naval drills, 150 capital ships and support ships. It is a massive naval task force. This is 2 or 3 times the size of the whole of the Royal Navy. They are exercising with their allies, who foremost amongst them is the Iranians. Some of the videos the Russians are putting out would appear that the Russian Navy is exercising with a couple of Iranian tugboats. That seems a little bit odd, but it's very much a show of power. The Russian Navy is the 3rd largest on the planet after the American, some way behind the Americans, and then the Chinese. I think it's very much at this time where things are finely balanced in Ukraine. Pretty much the professional Russian army has been destroyed in Ukraine, that Russia is trying to flex its military muscles. But actually, when you look at it a little bit closer, there's a pretty thin veneer. This is classic Russian propaganda and sort of disinformation to try and show, we have the most powerful navy on the planet. We can project power anywhere we like. But actually, when you look down to it, a lot of these Russian naval ships are pretty ancient. We usually say that Russian military technology is 5 years behind American. But actually, when it comes to their navy, it's probably considerably more. Nobody, I expect, will have missed the one Russian aircraft carrier that chugged up and down the British Channel a few times and into the Mediterranean a few years ago, which has now had to be scrapped because it's such poor position. And again, when it comes to submarines, and there appear to be a lot of submarines on show here, again, Russian technology. People remember the Kursk submarine that sank with all hands a few years ago. In fact, Britain offered to rescue the submariners, but Putin was so embarrassed by the terrible state of the Russian Navy that he didn't accept that. So it is a show of force. There are a lot of aircraft there as well. But again, the aircraft are all pretty ancient. The sort of strap line for this exercise is it's demonstrating Russia's latest ability to be able to operate in the current battle space against all sort of threats, including UAVs. But on closer inspection, I would certainly prefer to be sat in a Royal Naval ship or a US ship than one of these Russian rust buckets, I think. Well, I expect NATO will be having an absolute field day. The intelligence value to NATO will be absolutely top end, first class. No doubt there will be an awful lot of NATO intelligence assets shadowing these ships, looking at these exercises or reminding them of the operating procedures. No doubt there will be lots of detailed study of the ships, any new bits of kit they might have on. So I expect NATO will be learning a heck of a lot more than the Russians will be, because the Russians are really putting themselves on display. And in this electronic dominated world at the moment, it's very difficult to hide. And a lot of military operations, one of the key elements is surprise. And, in a way, it's sort of strange that the Russians are exposing their military capability in such an open fashion to NATO. So I think NATO will be learning a heck of a lot, hoovering up an awful lot, and no doubt conducting a bit of electronic warfare themselves on the Russian fleet. So don't be surprised if a few ships breaking down for unknown reasons. I think still what Russia is trying to do is project naval power, flexing its muscles. But I think in this case, it's probably a bit of an own goal. The Black Sea Fleet, I think, is a real thorn in Putin's side. As much vaunted as being one of the Russian Navy's great fleets, but it was destroyed pretty much by a country, Ukraine, that doesn't have a navy. And that was very significant because it meant that at the beginning of the war, Russia had freedom of maneuver in the Black Sea and could conduct operations unfettered. But once the Ukraine Navy and other supporting military elements destroyed the capital ships, and then a lot of the ports in Crimea, particularly Sebastopol, which was Russia's main naval port, the bottom of the southern tip of Crimea, was pretty much made unusable because of mainly Ukrainian drones drones, shipborne drones that could travel thousands of miles and then blow up these ships. And the Black Sea Fleet really is not in the Black Sea anymore, or certainly what's left of it. It's been pushed away. So a huge embarrassment. But it sort of reflects the state of the whole of the Russian Navy, that it's very vulnerable, pretty ancient, and it's currently Putin is using it to project power, to show probably more for an internal audience that Russia is still a major power and can flex its muscles. And I think people are beginning to realize, particularly in Moscow and St. Petersburg, where the rich and the well-appointed live in Russia, that things are not going well in Ukraine. And the Black Sea Fleet is a personification of that. This indestructible naval power that Russia had is now at the bottom of the Black Sea. The Black Sea Fleet's not there. And what is on display on close scrutiny is pretty unimpressive. And let's hope that people realize that, rather than see 150 ships steaming around. Actually, the capability that they possess is pretty minimal compared to particularly the US high seas fleets, which are more modern, more capable, and supported by fourth generation jets like F-35As and Bs, whereas the Russians are showing bare bombers that are 50, 60 years old. I think what is on display is something very much from the last century and not from the 21st century. Ships have always been vulnerable, as we saw in the Falklands War, to Exocet missiles. The Royal Navy lost a number of ships to that, but then a counter was done, and ships have been pretty much impervious until the explosion in drone warfare in the last few years. But with lasers, there appears to be a counter to that. So I think we probably write off naval power. If we write it off too early, we might be found wanting. So I think certainly Britain, that has always been a maritime nation, it's sort of interred in our bones. So I think the ability to operate in the sea lanes is still something that is very important, but protection of those very expensive bits of military hardware are absolutely key. And it's a question of staying one jump ahead of the game. But, at the moment, we know that our adversary, the Russians, technologically are one step behind us. So as long as we can stay in front, I think there'll still be very much a role for the Navy going forward. I'm sure the Russians are pretty stretched. They're operating where they can. They probably couldn't operate in the Atlantic because of the plethora of US and British and other NATO shipping and surveillance devices. Operating the Pacific, they can probably claim that they're working alongside the Chinese, and that is a key contested area. But at the same time, the British and the US fleets are in the Pacific as well. And I'm sure Russia is trying to show that it can still match the big boys, as it were, and have the capability. But unlike British and American ships that can virtually go into any port around the world and get fueled up and food, Russia just doesn't have those allies, apart from perhaps the Iranians, the North Koreans, maybe the Chinese, and a few others.